Welcome, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling something really, really important, and it's complex, too, the exploitation of Africa. We're going to be using excerpts from this podcast called Voices Unheard, an episode called The Great Exploitation of Africa, A Legacy of Plunder and Promise. So we're going to be looking through history, how things have evolved, and importantly, how Africa's fighting back.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a story of a continent. It's so rich in resources, culture, and history, but it's been burdened by this systematic exploitation. But also it's a story of amazing resilience and, the fight for a future, a brighter future.
Okay, so let's set the stage here. If you think about it, the late 19th century, you have this period called the Scramble for Africa. And it's crazy. European powers, they basically just carved up a whole continent at this Berlin conference in 1884. Like, no regard for the people actually living there.
And it's interesting because that colonial era, you can still feel its impact today. And it wasn't just about drawing lines on a map, right? It was about taking those resources like gold, diamonds, rubber, a lot of times through forced labor.
Yeah, and I mean, we can't forget about, King Leopold II of Belgium and what happened in the Congo. His regime was brutal, driven by greed for rubber and ivory, and millions of people died. It's a really, really dark chapter.
And unfortunately, we saw similar patterns of exploitation under the British, the French, the Portuguese. You think about it, local economies were totally disrupted. People were forced from farming for their families to growing like cash crops like cotton and cocoa, just all to enrich these colonial powers.
It's incredible how much wealth was extracted from the continent, all built on the backs of the African people. Then we have this surge of independence movements in the mid-20th century. We see inspiring leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Patrice Lumumba in the Congo fighting for freedom. I mean, what a moment that must have been.
Independence was huge, but it's also important to see how that transition was often manipulated. Former colonial powers, they kind of kept their control through trade, multinational corporations, aid. It's almost like cutting the strings of a puppet, but still having the puppeteer there.
So even though flags changed and things like that, the exploitation continued just in a different way.
Exactly. It's what we call neo-colonialism. A good example is France. They still have influence over former colonies because of this CFA franc currency. And a lot of people argue that that keeps these countries tied to France economically, preventing real independence.
And then you have institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. On the surface, they seem to be all about development. But these structural adjustment programs that aim for economic growth, sometimes it seems like they benefit the creditors more than the African nations they're supposed to help. Didn't Zambia have some real problems with those programs?
Yeah, Zambia is a perfect example. They had to deal with these austerity measures, and that led to cuts in services, healthcare, education, and it really hit the most vulnerable people the hardest. It raises the question, who are these programs really benefiting?
So we've gone from this very direct colonial rule to a more subtle kind of control. It's really discouraging to see these patterns, but let's move ahead to the present. Africa's still incredibly rich in resources. I mean, the leading producer of cobalt, which is crucial for, electronics, electric vehicles. But I feel like there's a but coming here.
You're right. Even with all these resources, most of the profits, they don't stay in Africa. Think about the DRC. They have so much cobalt, but they face child labor, dangerous mining conditions. The companies that make our phones, our electric cars, they're making huge profits, while a lot of Congolese miners are suffering. Just because a country has resources doesn't mean it's going to be prosperous. It can actually be a way to exploit them further.
Yeah, it's a real wake-up call to think about the hidden costs of all the things we use every day.
Yeah.
And it's not just minerals, right? What about land grabbing?
Right. Wealthy nations, big corporations, they're buying up huge amounts of African farmland to, secure their own food.
Yeah.
But that pushes local farmers off their land, makes food insecurity worse. Imagine losing your family's land, your way of life, to some foreign company that only cares about profit.
It's almost like a new version of the colonial land grab, just with different players. And then there's oil. You have countries like Nigeria, Angola, Libya, big oil producers, but
you have corruption, environmental damage, and the wealth isn't shared equally. So a lot of people stay poor, even though their country has these resources. It's that classic resource curse. Africa's rich under the ground, but poor above it.
So many layers to this, but one thing's for sure, exploitation's still happening in all sorts of ways. It's kind of overwhelming when you see how deep all this exploitation runs. But before we get too bummed out, let's think about something else for a sec. We've been talking about the economics, the politics, all that, but what about how the media shows Africa? I mean, Could those stories actually be part of the problem?
Oh, you're totally right to bring that up. The way the world sees Africa in the media, it shapes how people think, and that can really keep this exploitation going.
Because if all we see are, like, pictures of poverty and war, it makes it seem like Africa's helpless, right? Like they always need saving.
Exactly. It's that danger of a single story, you know? It makes it seem like they're so different from us, and that makes it easier to justify stepping in, even if it's more about self-interest than actually helping. Like, just focusing on sending food during a famine without fixing the politics or the economy that caused it in the first place. That just keeps people dependent.
You mentioned that single story thing. What parts of life in Africa don't we get to see because of those big common narratives?
We miss out on so much. We don't see how resilient people are, how creative they are in solving problems. We don't see the amazing cultures, the progress they're making. Think about tech hubs like Silicon Savannah in Kenya. There's so much innovation, so many entrepreneurs, but you don't hear about that in the news.
It's like we're getting a messed up picture, a distorted view, and that has real consequences, you know? How do we get away from these harmful stories and start telling the truth, a more balanced truth?
First, we got to be aware. Look at what you're reading, what you're watching, and really think about it. Question what you're told, and try to find different viewpoints. Look for stories told by Africans in their own voices.
So, giving a voice to those who haven't been heard, how can we, actually support that change?
We can look for and support media outlets, groups that are showing all the different sides of Africa, and follow African creators, writers, artists, activists. That helps get those real voices out there.
It's about digging deeper, going beyond the headlines and stereotypes, seeing the real people, the richness, all the diversity that's in Africa. But you talked about those glimmers of hope earlier. What are some examples of pushback, a positive change that's actually happening?
Well, we mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Area before. That's all about boosting trade within Africa so they don't have to depend on outside markets as much. That could be a total game changer, so it's worth keeping an eye on.
Definitely. What other things give you hope? What are you excited about?
This movement for land rights and food sovereignty, it's so inspiring. Communities are coming together to take back land that was grabbed by investors, and they're focusing on ways to farm that help local people first. It's about taking control, taking their future back into their own hands.
Yeah, it's a great reminder that change can happen when people get together and work for something they believe in. Are there any people who really represent that resistance for you?
Wangari Maathai, she was amazing. She was this Kenyan environmental activist, won the Nobel Peace Prize. Her Green Belt movement planted millions of trees all across Africa. That not only fights deforestation, but it also gives women more power. She shows us that even with huge problems, just one person can make a difference. Big difference.
Those stories of resistance are really powerful, really uplifting. It feels like there's a new story being told, one of strength and hope.
You're right. There's this growing movement, people challenging the way things are, demanding that people be held accountable. They're shaping a better future for Africa.
But I think a lot of people feel overwhelmed by all the problems. Like, how do we fight that feeling of being powerless?
One of the sneakiest things about this exploitation narrative is that it makes you feel like you can't do anything. But the truth is, we all have a part to play. Start by learning, being aware, listening to those who are most affected. Support organizations that are working directly in Africa. Talk to your leaders. Push for policies that are fair, that help things grow in a good way. And when you see injustice, speak up.
So it's about taking responsibility, even if it feels small, and realizing we're all connected, all part of this one world.
Yeah, every choice we make, from what we buy to who we vote for, it all has an impact. We have to ask ourselves, am I making things worse, or am I part of the solution?
That's a tough question, but it's one we gotta ask. We have to go beyond just knowing about these problems and actually do something to make the world more just. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. We went through centuries of exploitation, saw how it's changed, and heard some pretty inspiring stories of, people fighting back. It's a lot to take in. So, as we wrap up, what are the big things we should remember going forward?
Well, I think it's really important to remember that exploitation in Africa, it's not just history, it's still happening today, often in ways that are harder to see. We got to be aware of that, recognize the patterns.
And we talked about how the stories we hear, the media, it can either reinforce these bad stereotypes or it can help us hear the real voices of people in Africa. We have to be smart about what we read and watch and, search out different viewpoints.
Exactly. We can't just rely on like the mainstream news to give us the whole picture. We have to go deeper. Read African writers, watch films made by Africans, listen to their artists and journalists. That's how we start to understand what's really going on.
It's about moving past that one single story, past this idea that, Africa's helpless. We need to see the strength, the creativity, the amazing cultures that are thriving all over.
You got it. And in this deep dive, we saw so many examples of people resisting, fighting for their rights, protecting their land, taking control of their future. It's really amazing to see that human spirit, that resilience.
It's incredibly inspiring, but I think a lot of us are probably sitting here thinking, okay, that's great, but what can I actually do? How do I make a difference?
One thing you can do is look at your own habits, like what you buy. Every time you spend money, you're supporting something. So ask yourself, are you supporting companies that exploit people or the environment? Or are you choosing things that are ethical, sustainable?
So it's about being a conscious consumer, doing some research before you buy something, and really understanding the impact of your choices.
Yeah, think about where stuff comes from, who's benefiting, and what it costs, not just in money, but for the environment and for people.
It's realizing that we're not just shoppers, we're global citizens, right? And we have a responsibility to use our choices to make things better.
And it's not just about buying stuff. We can speak up too. Support organizations that are working to help people in Africa. Talk to your politicians. Tell them you want policies that are fair, that support responsible businesses. And when you see injustice, don't be silent. Say something.
I know these problems can feel huge, but like we saw in this deep dive, when we work together, we can create real change.
Absolutely. Each of us can play a part, even if it seems small. By learning, making good choices, and speaking up for those who are fighting for justice, we can help build a better, fairer future for Africa and for everyone.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something, that you feel inspired, and maybe even a little fired up to take action. Remember, the story of Africa is still being written, and we all have a role to play shaping what comes next.